No, oh yeah, I don't need sound with that. I just need this sound. Okay. Well, I am loath to interrupt such joyful chatting, but we have to get through 400 plus years of history in 45 minutes, so I'm just going to dive in. So just quickly, I was not actually originally scheduled to be the forum today. We had Professor Greg Mobley, who was not able to come due to illness. So this was a two-part class that I was just going to do in the chapel for however many people came. This is part one, Book of Common Prayer history. Part two, next Sunday, if you'd like, if you're interested, we'll actually crack open the book and kind of dig into the book itself. So just, yes, hopefully this is enough of an exciting proposition that you'll want to join me next week in the chapel. So, the Book of Common Prayer, a short history. Before going to the prayer book itself, I want to just talk briefly about what the church was like in England before the prayer book, before the Reformation, because there's this sort of popular imagination that there was a rebellion against something, that the Catholic Church was deeply unpopular. That's not really true. At the time of just before the prayer book just before Henry VIII kind of begins the English Reformation, it's estimated that 1 in 50 men were under holy orders in England. So clearly, a lot of people were committed to this. The church had a lot of power, had a lot of money. This is actually the ruins of Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire. It was one of the largest churches in England. So this was not a fait accompli. It was not obvious that the English church would reform in this way. So now, slide 2. I do want to then dig into just a little background on the Reformation. So, October 31st, All Hallows Eve, Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. Whether or not he actually nailed them is a subject of debate, but he was an Augustinian monk and a professor, and he had some strong feelings, and he let those feelings be known. And so actually this is what the Wittenberg Cathedral looks like today. The doors have been replaced, and this is now a bronze door with the 95 Theses cast onto it. Now, in 1521, so this is a process. He's not immediately kind of declared a heretic. The Diet of Worms, it's actually would be better called a Reichstag. That was in 1521, and this is when Luther kind of goes it alone. He is declared a heretic by the Catholic Church, and it is in this gathering. It goes over about 6 months, this kind of debate between Luther and the Catholic archdiocese there. And it's at the end of this that he says the famous lines, "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise." And this is the beginning of Lutheranism, the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Now, what kind of gets short shrift is we have this Lutheran strain of Protestantism, but people are often not aware of what was happening in Switzerland. So in Zurich, around the same time, there's a man named Huldrych Zwingli, that is Ulrich himself, and he begins ministering. He's the priest of a church in Zurich, and he begins this preaching series. He just preaches through the entire Gospel of Matthew. And then he likes it so much that he then preaches through the entire New Testament. And this new way of approaching Scripture and diving into it. And over a period of time, Zwingli begins attacking popular piety. He attacks fasting during Lent. And in 1525, actually creates a reformed communion mass. So this is another strand of Protestantism. It kind of becomes what we would think of as capital R Reformed, like the Dutch Reformed Church or the Swiss Reformed Church. So this is another strand of Protestantism that's happening at the same time on the continent. Zwingli dies in battle in 1531 when there is a civil war between the Catholic cantons of the Swiss Federation and the Protestant Reformed cantons. Now, Henry VIII. This is kind of our big character. So it's important to acknowledge kind of what happened before Henry. So Henry's father, Henry VII, when he becomes king, this is the end of the War of the Roses, which was a kind of long-running, almost a century-long civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York. So when Henry VIII becomes king in April 24th, 1509, he is the first adult prince to peacefully inherit the throne in almost a century. So this is part of the backstory of what's happening here. His older brother, Arthur, was married to Catherine of Aragon very briefly, and then he died suddenly. And because the dowry hadn't really been worked out, she remains in England in limbo for the next 7 years. Henry is 10 at the time. And so when Henry's father, when Henry VII dies, Henry VIII, one of the first things he does is he marries this cute young princess who is now, I think, 7 years older than him. Henry, at the beginning, is very, very against the Reformation. He actually writes an entire book about it. Henry thought of himself as a bit of a scholar. Whether or not that was earned is debatable, but he had pretty high opinions of himself. And he actually wrote an entire book against the Reformation, arguing against Luther, and for it, in 1527, earlier than that, he receives the title of Defender of the Faith from Pope Leo. Catherine and Henry, as we know, are not able to conceive a son. This is a long process. You keep trying, it's not working. And remember, we just ended the War of the Roses. So this really matters. This is very important that there is an heir and that it's clear and that the line of succession is, there's no messing around with that. So in 1527, Henry VIII formally asks the Pope for an annulment of his marriage. His argument being that because Catherine was married before, it's kind of, they kind of fudged it. But the problem with asking for an annulment is that, this is a map of the Holy Roman Empire, so Charles V is the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. He is also the King of Spain, the Archduke of Austria, the King of Naples and Sicily, the Lord of the Netherlands, and the Duke of Burgundy. A very powerful, impressive, important man. He's a Habsburg. He also happens to be the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. So obviously that complicates matters a little bit when Henry's appealing to the Pope. Additionally, in 1527, Charles's troops, who were threatening Rome, but it was not his intention, but they kind of get out of hand and they sack Rome and take the Pope, which Pope is it at the time? They take the Pope hostage for a brief period of time. So, obviously, as much as Henry VIII would have liked to, or as much as the Pope would have liked to help Henry VIII, he's kind of being pressed from the other side. So there's this long back and forth, which inevitably results in the annulment not being granted. And so in 1534, Henry VIII decides to go his own way. And the Act of Supremacy is declared by Parliament, and Henry VIII is named Supreme Head of the Church of England. This is the beginning of this sort of rolling process. So in this, he dissolves the monasteries and the shrines, taking their considerable resources for himself. This is actually, a lot of that land is then redistributed to people who are in his favor. So, Downton Abbey, the reason why it's called an abbey is because there were lots of lands that had been previously abbeys and were now used by royals. Then he authorizes a translation of the Bible called the Great Bible, which is published in 1539. As you can see, he had a high opinion of himself because there he is sitting right there at the top, looking very important and fancy. But though Henry's leaning into being the supreme head of the church and he's interested in seizing the wealth from the monasteries, he's not a true convert. He doesn't actually really change things that dramatically. He keeps the Latin Mass. He insists on clerical celibacy, which is complicated because his Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who we'll hear a lot about, has a wife and kids who he kind of has to hide and send off to the continent for a few years. And then he also, one of the things he insists upon is communion in one kind. We kind of lose sight of this history, but up until the Reformation, the laity would only receive the bread. They would not receive the wine. And usually you would only receive communion 3-4 times a year, at least once. So this is a big change or there's not as big a change as you would have thought with Henry. Henry is kind of slow walking it. He's not comfortable with this Reformation stuff that's happening. But because Henry is worried about the laity not fully understanding what's happening in worship, he authorizes Thomas Cranmer to write 2 prayers in 1544, which are the first authorized English vernacular prayers. One is called the Great Litany, the other is the Exhortation. The Litany we actually still have in the prayer book, and it's basically unchanged. There are some edits to kind of make it a little bit more readable, getting rid of some of the miserable similar language. Also, I do enjoy, we did get rid of the really, really anti-Catholic language. If you look at the original 1544, there is a prayer that we want God to deliver us from the tyranny of the Bishop of Rome and all his detestable enormities. So that was a thing you would have been saying in worship service. And a litany would be traditionally said as a procession. So you can see this picture. This is a Catholic procession, but it gives you a sense of it would be sung with the choir repeating the follow-up of, good Lord, deliver us, or whatever it might be. The exhortation is a teaching text. It was said before communion, encouraging Christians to understand what they were doing, to examine themselves properly before they received communion, and to think about the purpose and efficacy of prayer. Now, Henry dies, and his young son, Edward VI, inherits the throne. Edward, who is 9 at the time, this is, I think, a great painting I found from Elizabethan times, but there you have Edward being declared king by his father, and there's the Pope getting knocked in the head by a book, and on the Pope it says, "All flesh is gross." So it's quite the allegorical painting. Now, Edward is you might be wondering, Henry, 6 wives, which one? Edward? Edward is the only surviving son of his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. Edward's uncle serves as regent, and at this moment in time, the reformers are kind of in power. This is the thing about Henry. Henry kind of plays back and forth the more conservative, small c, Catholic-minded people versus the more reform-minded, more Protestant-minded members of his council. And at this point in time, when Edward comes to power, it's the reformers who are in power. From all appearances, Edward was actually a very convinced Protestant. Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop, tutors him, and Edward is really, really interested in this. Now, the first communion in vernacular, in English, is written in 1548. This serves for about 15 months, and it's this really odd document because basically the entire Mass would have been in Latin, and then all of a sudden, English just gets inserted because up until that point, the laity would not receive the cup, so they needed to add some of that language, and then they also just needed to make sure that people understood what was happening. So you would have a Latin Mass basically up until communion began, and then you would transition into English for the exhortation, prayer of humble access, the confession, and then the words of administration themselves, body of Christ, the bread of heaven, that sort of thing. Now this is in place. This was, as you'll see, Cranmer's idea was that things needed to move slowly. He didn't want to change everything so dramatically, and so this was a way to kind of adjust people to the idea of worshiping in English. And so this first vernacular communion is in place for about 15 months until 1549, the Act of Uniformity is promulgated, and we have our first prayer book. The prayer book is mandated to be used by Pentecost of that year. And this is actually the inside cover of that first prayer book. It is actually, in many ways, a fairly conservative document, despite the fact that it is in English. It draws heavily from the Sarum rite, which was the Salisbury. This was the traditional Eucharist rite in England at the time. And so basically, Cranmer just takes that rite, which would have been familiar, and just translates it over into English. The book is also inspired by the monastic rhythm. It has morning prayer and evening prayer. Cranmer drew some from the Continental Reformers, and I think this is also fascinating. Cranmer was inspired by this Spanish cardinal, Miguel Quiñones, who had this innovation of actually putting all the books into one place. Because up until that point, you kind of had to juggle. You'd have your missal to celebrate Mass, but then you'd have the lectionary to read the readings from, and then you had your Psalter to read the Psalms from. And so Quiñones recognizes, actually, let's put it all into one book, and that's part of what inspires Cranmer. The document, as I said, is somewhat of a compromise. And it feels still very Catholic in ritual, though it has these Protestant influences. But the reformers who are there are immediately agitating for a new edit. So at this point in time, we have a bunch of continental reformers who have come over. There's an Italian man named Vermigli, Martin Bucer is a German, and all these guys are writing pamphlets saying, didn't go far enough. 1549, not good enough. So within a couple of years, well, first the one thing about the 1549 book is there's not a ordination rite. So in 1550, this is the original spelling, just to give you a sense of how confusing it could be to read before spelling was standardized. We had an ordination rite that was created in 1550, and then in 1552 there is another act of uniformity which puts forward this new book of Common Prayer, which has to be in use by All Saints' Day. Now, this is a significantly more reformed book. So ornate vestments are discouraged. We don't understand actually the degree to which vestments would have been a source of disagreement, but wearing a chasuble, wearing sumptuous robes and that sort of thing was discouraged. And so this book, vestments are discouraged. A stone altar is discouraged. Now, actually, instead of an altar, which implies sacrifice, it's now a communion table. And the table, instead of being up, would actually be brought down into the nave and turned perpendicular to the nave. So the priest would be standing among the people at the head of the table with the people gathered around. It's no longer called a Mass, it's called the Lord's Supper or Holy Communion. Ordinary bread is encouraged to be used instead of wafers to try to discourage this idea of there's something special or magical about the communion itself. There is also this interesting note that the prayer book does encourage people to kneel to receive communion, but the reformers really don't like this, so they add in a little section which is called the Black Rubric, which was published afterwards and pasted into books, explaining how you were kneeling as a sign of reverence, but not worshiping the host. It's this very fine-grained assessment. Oh, my children are having lots of fun. I do love that. So what's interesting about this is that had Edward continued to live, one imagines that reform would have continued. This process would have kept happening. Edward was very, very committed to this. But Edward dies, 1553, and he attempts to pass the crown to Lady Jane Grey. That lasts literally 9 days, and his older half-sister, Mary I, is crowned queen. She is a Catholic. She is Catherine of Aragon's daughter, and she immediately reverts back to Catholicism. It's interesting. She tries to kind of make everything go back. She can't she can't give the lands and the money back. That part doesn't work. So the parliament is like, no, we're not, we like the lands and money, we're going to hold on to those. But everything else, she really swings back as much as possible. Hundreds of reformers flee to the continent, and over 280 are burned at the stake. Thomas Cranmer is kind of the most famous of those. The story about it is he recanted a number of times, and recanted so fully that the canon law in Rome said, that's fine. This is, he has followed what he needs to. He's no longer a heretic. He can't serve in the church, but we don't need to burn him at the stake. And Mary said, no, he's too important. We need to burn him at the stake. So when he's supposed to be burned at the stake, he has one final decree that he's going to read. He goes up in the pulpit of University Church in Oxford, begins with his written remarks, and then pivots and renounces all of his previous recantations, declares the Pope to be the enemy of Christ, curses his hand for writing those recantations, and declares that it'll be the first to burn. And then when he dies, the story says that actually his heart remained in the coals, and it was this pure. Anyway, so this is the world that we lived in there, and they were not actually that far removed from the medieval times. Mary then dies quite early herself in 1558, and so we have then Elizabeth. who ascends the throne. Her younger half-sister, who is the daughter of Anne Boleyn. Now, Elizabeth is a Protestant, and so she swings things back towards the Reformed side. She is declared head of the church with a new Act of Supremacy in 1558, and then a new Act of Uniformity in 1559, which basically republishes the 52 prayer book with a few edits. But then that's about it. What kind of follows after that is what's called the Elizabethan settlement, which is this kind of compromise of we're not going to go much farther than we had. We're going to kind of keep the Protestantism as far as we went, but we're not going to revert back to full Catholicism either. And so both sides, as compromises often happen, are not happy. And this is where the Puritans kind of come from, is that they're agitating for more change and for more, and there is not. Now, I've heard it described that actually the Elizabethan settlement is this Catholic structure. The worship still feels very Catholic, but with a Protestant theology underneath. And within it, there is this possibility of kind of doing both things. So you can have a very high church, very Anglo-Catholic, with the sumptuous vestments, with the incense and bells and singing, and you can also have the low church. You can have no stained glass. You can have more simple robes, and the church has and makes space for both of them. As long as you agree that Elizabeth is the supreme head of the church, and as long as you use the prayer book, you can do kind of what you want with it. And this is I think one of the great gifts of our prayer book, is that we might disagree about all sorts of things, but we pray together. We use the same words when we pray together. Now, the one problem is for the Roman Catholics who do remain faithful to Rome. They are kind of forced to go underground and actually become somewhat of a suspicious group because the priests are foreign, and so then there's this xenophobia, traitorous thing that then kind of gets wrapped up into that, unfortunately. Now, Elizabeth, as we know, Virgin Queen, 44 years rule. She dies, and her cousin, James I, who is also James VI of Scotland, he inherits the crown. So he becomes king in 1603. He approves some minor edits to the prayer book in 1604, but decides to focus his real energies on this new Bible, which then gets published in 1611, and we know as the King James Bible. There is this moment, because he is Scottish, and the Presbyterian approach, the more Reformed, more Catholic approach is popular there. There is a moment when the Reformed Party in England are excited. They think he's going to bring these reforms to England, but he doesn't. He kind of maintains the Elizabethan settlement and maintains this kind of halfway thing that happens. Now, while that is happening in England, there is a Book of Common Order that John Knox, who serves in England and then goes up and then is in exile in Geneva. He compiles this Book of Common Order while in exile, which is then brought to Scotland and becomes the basis of Scottish worship, kind of the basis of this Scottish Presbyterian liturgy. Now, we're jumping ahead here, but in 1637, Charles I, James's son, who is now king, he attempts to introduce a Scottish prayer book to Scotland. This happens on July 23rd, which is a Sunday, and it uses the 1549 prayer book, which, as we remember, is a more Catholic book. So for the past 100 or so years, the Scots have been using this very reformed book, even more reformed than anything in England, and now Charles I is trying to bring them all the way back to 1549. This does not go well. This is a famous story. There was some lead up, so people knew, and so there are all these protests that kind of were planned. And one of them was this woman, Jenny Geeds, who threw her stool at the Bishop of Edinburgh and said something in a very intense Scottish accent that I won't even attempt to say. So this book kind of begins actually to be the beginning of Charles's downfall. There is a war with England and Scotland, and this is kind of the snowballing of Charles needs to raise more funds, Parliament, back and forth. I'm going to butcher the history, but just know this is how Charles I kind of begins to lose his grip on power, which inevitably results in Charles's beheading. 1645, the Book of Common Prayer is actually banned. The Parliament, which is very reformed, is in power. This is Oliver Cromwell and all his ilk. The Directory of Public Worship, which is a very reformed document, is the primary form of worship in England at the time. And so the people who support the Book of Common Prayer kind of go underground. Now, Charles I is beheaded in 1647, and Cromwell remains in power until his death, at which point Charles II is brought back from exile, Charles's son, and he becomes king. And in 1662, the Book of Common Prayer is then republished. And so this gives you a sense, just constantly swinging back and forth. Charles I, who leaned more small c Catholic, more high church, he is eventually booted by the reformers, by Oliver Cromwell, by Parliament. They have this whole document that is significantly more reformed than when they get booted, or when they kind of fall out of power and Charles II comes in, the Book of Common Prayer returns. And so it actually goes from being this document that was viewed with suspicion to being this document that's kind of appreciated and loved, and there's a sense of ownership over. So the 1662 prayer book is then published, as I said, and that is now the last edit. That's the last official edit of the prayer book in England. The Church of England's prayer book is still the 1662 prayer book. It remains the standard until today. Now, there is an attempt beginning in the 19th century, going into the early 20th century, to have formal edits allowed into the prayer book. They actually get so far as having a final draft approved by the church in 1928, but that draft fails in Parliament. And so the 1662 still remains the standard. Instead of going through Parliament, then in 1980, there's the Alternative Service Book, and then 2000, Common Worship, which is what you can see, all those different books are, which is kind of more modern language, pulling in some of the knowledge that had been gained during the liturgical movement of the 1930s, which we will get to in a little bit. Now, we are going to jump back in time and across continents to here. Now, the first Anglican service in what is now the United States happened in 1607 in Jamestown. This is a picture of Reverend Robert Hunt, who was the chaplain of that expedition at Jamestown. I doubt it was this romantic looking, but it was the best image I could find. The church in England, the Church of England in the Americas, is actually somewhat limited in scope, particularly in the 17th century. The Northeast is mostly Congregationalists, these Puritans. We've got the Quakers in Pennsylvania. In Maryland, we've got some Catholics. New York, we've got godless capitalists. And then, seeing you're paying attention. And then we have a few strongholds. I mean, Virginia is Church of England, and as are some of the southern colonies, but it's not actually, the church is pretty weak, which inspires this gentleman, this Reverend Thomas Bray, who, interestingly enough, though he is really instrumental to the church in America, only visits the United States for like a few months. When he founded two really important organizations. The first is the Society for Promoting of Christian Knowledge in 1698, which creates libraries in both England and the colonies. He actually is responsible for creating over 100 libraries in the colonies because he recognized that young ministers who were coming to the colonies were usually quite poor, had less opportunity, that's why they were coming here, and that meant they did not have the books that they needed to actually do their job. And so he was instrumental in creating all these libraries. He then also, in 1701, creates the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, which is still ongoing. It's an organization, a mission organization that still exists today, which helps found parishes both in England and abroad. In his lifetime, he helped found 39 parishes in the 13 colonies, which is remarkable considering he only spent a few months of his life here. Now, so the church begins to grow in the 18th century, and then we remember what happens, revolution, which is complicated for the Anglicans, because part of the Anglican polity is that the king is supreme head of the church. All clergy are required, or as part of their ordination vows, are making a loyalty pledge to the king, to the crown. So many Anglicans actually remain loyalist during the Revolution. And it's at this time that a Anglican who's not, William White, who is a priest in Philadelphia, he begins thinking about what it might be for there to be a new American church. He writes a pamphlet talking about the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States. He's the first person to use that language. And he proposes a more democratic government for our church, which is what we still have today. Just a quick aside, you might not realize the presiding bishop is not the head of the church. The head of the church is the General Convention of the Episcopal Church. So General Convention is above the presiding bishop. We are different than other Anglican communities that it might be an archbishop who's the head. No, we have a democratic government that is the supreme head. Now, he also explores this question of bishops, which is a complicated one, and floats the idea that we could make our own bishops, which you will see is not the path we go down. That's actually where the Methodists go and remains a point of contention between us and the Methodists. Anyway, now, the war is won. Many Anglicans actually flee. They either go back to England or go up to Canada. But there's this problem all of a sudden, which is that there were no bishops in the United States. Up until that point, every single clergy person here in the colonies was under the supervision of the Bishop of London. So the thing about bishops is that you need bishops to make bishops. So if we don't have any bishops, then how can we make bishops? So Samuel Seabury is elected by the Diocese of Connecticut, or what will become the Diocese of Connecticut, to go over to England to be consecrated as bishop. And he goes to London and is told, no, you just rebelled. How's that going to work? You need to declare loyalty to the king. We can't, this makes no sense. So after he is rebuffed, he then goes up to Scotland. Now here's a little aside. If you remember your English history, you'll remember James II is deposed in what is known as the Glorious Revolution in 1689. And when he is deposed, William and Mary come in, and they are declared the new king and queen. There's a group of clergy who actually, some of these clergy had been jailed by James II, and yet they hold the line and say, our oath of loyalty is to this line, to James and to his progeny. And so they actually say, no, we don't approve of this new king and queen. And so this becomes what is known as the non-juring, I don't even know what the word would be. Anyway, it's the non-juring thing. And so some of these non-juror clergy are kind of tossed out of the church, and a group of them are Scottish bishops. And so the Scottish bishops become booted out. The church in Scotland becomes fully Presbyterian. There are no longer bishops. It is now organized as a presbytery, church by church, with no overarching episcopate. But these Scottish Episcopal these Scottish Episcopal bishops still continue on afterwards. And what's interesting is they hold on to this prayer book, this prayer book back all the way back here, this 1637 prayer book, which was based on the 1549 prayer book. That is the prayer book that the Scottish Episcopal Church uses. So when Seabury goes to the Scottish Episcopal Church and they say, sure, and they consecrate him in Aberdeen in 1784, hey, Siri. When they consecrate him, one of the stipulations that they have is, we will consecrate you, but we would love you to look at our prayer book. And we'd like you to just examine, particularly our Eucharist, and see if that's something we'd like you to advocate for that. So Seabury actually agrees to this and brings back that Eucharist, which will be very important in just a moment. Now, a year later, William White, who was a loyalist, or not a loyalist, who was a revolutionary, and Samuel Provost, who is from New York, both go over to England. And at this point, the English bishops go, oops, we kind of messed up with the Seabury thing. Let's figure this out with the two of you. And so they are both consecrated bishop in London, and actually at their consecration, the archbishops of York and Canterbury are both present. So this is kind of line of apostolic succession is maintained. This is really important. Fascinating thing is that Seabury and White and Provost hate Seabury. Absolutely despise Seabury because he was a loyalist. And so there's this moment where it's kind of unclear if there are going to be these two lines of apostolic succession at the same time. And the three of them are able to get into the same room one time to consecrate one bishop, and then that settles that, and then they never had to talk again. So, as you know, nothing was ever hunky-dory and easy. So the first prayer book in the United States is in 1789. And this is a document that is very similar to the 62 prayer book, actually, in a lot of ways, except for the Eucharist. The Eucharist is taken from that Scottish book, which also draws from the 1549 book. And if you compare our Eucharist service to the 1662 prayer book, you will see it is very different. The Gloria is in a different place. The prayer itself is significantly longer in our worship. We have the epiclesis, which is the calling on of the Holy Spirit to come down. The language is much more sacrificial, which was complicated for the reformers, as I mentioned earlier. But this becomes our Eucharist service, and I'm biased. I like it better. But this is an important part of what develops in our prayer book. Now, there is a second prayer book in 1892. This only has minor edits. It's not actually that different. The biggest edit being that you're no longer, the expectation up to that point. If you think our services are long, let me tell you, it used to be that you'd do an entirety of morning prayer and then do an entire Holy Communion. So that was the expectation. And in 1892, we're saying, well, people are modern. We've got, industrial revolutions happening. People don't have that much time. And so that's no longer mandated. The 1928 prayer book is the next one following. And there are actually significant edits here. Some of the biggest ones is moving away from language that was really kind of emphasized our sinfulness and emphasized God's anger at our sinfulness. There's also blessedly removed some languages from the Good Friday service that was quite horribly anti-Semitic. So the 28 prayer book is this change, and it's kind of trying to update with the times. And now in this intervening period, there is what's known as the liturgical movement, which begins in Germany and then kind of spreads, and it's not only in the Protestant church, it is also in the Catholic Church, and it's kind of coming back to what liturgy used to be. It's a lot of documents were rediscovered, and it's engaging with how do we bring the people into worship more? How do we share worship more readily with those? One of the big examples of this is if you've been to the Easter Vigil. It is one of the most beautiful, powerful services. The Easter Vigil is based on a 5th century worship service. This is an ancient worship service that kind of got lost for centuries. And when it was rediscovered, this is one of the things that gets included back in the 79 prayer book. So the 79 prayer book is a huge change from 28. The most obvious would be just the language. It's contemporary language. We are no longer with these and thous. We're yous and whatever the thee and the thou would be of you and you. So the modern language is the most obvious, but we also have some prayer services that are added. As I said, Easter Vigil. There are new Eucharistic prayers added. So we actually have 4, A, B, C, and D. A and B, so A is the one you'd be most familiar with. B is like a shorter version of A. C C is the one that's sometimes affectionately known as the Star Wars prayer. It's the one that we usually do during Easter, where we talk about the stars and interstellar space and all that. That was a completely modern one. And then prayer D, which we rarely use, but is absolutely gorgeous. And prayer D actually draws back from like the 6th century in ancient Egypt. So it's an old Eastern Orthodox, or it's an old Orthodox prayer that we've now adapted to our own use. So it gives you a sense of what this prayer book was drawing from and trying to kind of create all these new opportunities to worship and in new and enlivening ways and bringing people in. We also, in the 79 prayer book, get a wonderful bunch of historical documents that are in the back. So if you've ever flipped all the way to the end, you'll see some really, really, really fine print. And that's some of the older stuff that is fun to look at. Now, the 79 prayer book, there has often been a discussion, will there be another prayer book? The answer is probably not. It costs a lot of money to print a whole bunch of books. We have the internet now. And so the church's approach to that has been enriching our worship, which began in 1998. And some of those are just new Eucharist services that sometimes are more responsive from the congregation. Some just have different language. But then some of those services are actually written with a pastoral sense in mind. So, for example, a very tragic one, but there is a funeral service if it's a child who dies. We just didn't have a service that would meet that need, which is a different need, to be frank. There's also a pastoral need for wedding services that are not explicitly gendered, male and female. The Enriching Our Worship wedding is absolutely gorgeous. Actually, it was what Henley and I chose to do as our wedding because it just felt a little bit more to us. So this is what the prayer book looks like today. And I think that's actually about it. So that brings us up to modern times. That's a sense of the history of the prayer book. And then if you would like to come next week, we'll actually crack open the book and dig into some of those things. So I have a little bit of time. If anyone would have any questions. Questions. There we go. And we've got a question back there.
Tim, thanks. What changes were made to the catechism over the years in the back of the book?
I will be honest, I am not sure. I'm not sure that the catechism as it is written, that question and answer format, I don't think that was in the 28 prayer book. I think that is an addition of writing it that way. I don't think there was something like that before 79. Yeah. But I'm not 100% certain, so I apologize if I misled you. Other questions? Yes.
Vatican II, 1962.
Yes.
We follow that.
Yes. Vatican II. Yes. And so actually, I'm glad you brought up Vatican II. Vatican II, part of what inspires Vatican II is that liturgical movement that I was talking about. And people don't realize this. Vatican II was not just Catholics. I mean, it was Catholics were there, but there were also other denominations there present as observers. They didn't have voting power, obviously. The Church of England had no say in what was happening in canon law for the Catholics, but the Catholics were bringing in other ideas and perspectives. It was a much more conversational. Yeah, thank you. Yes? Where did the word Anglican come from? From Anglo, yeah, so yeah, just the English, yeah. Yes?
I was told that it became, when we had the Revolutionary War, we only had the Anglican Church.
Yes, well,
And to make a distinction, the people that wanted were royalists and the people, revolutionary people, they were called, became the Episcopalian.
yes.
And then maybe the other ones stayed Anglican. You follow my thinking? This is
Yes. There were certainly, it's a little more complicated than that, but yes, that is. Yes. And a fun little note, if you've ever, the Rector's Gallery, which is up near the family room, there are some display cases, and you can actually see the prayer book from this church where it's the 1662 prayer book where praying for King George is crossed off because we're not doing that part anymore. So yeah, it's that bit of history is still here.
Tim, the word Catholic, we refer to ourselves as being part of a Catholic and Apostolic Church.
Yes.
And I think that's confusing for people.
Yes.
Because Catholic has a meaning of all-encompassing.
Indeed. So yes, there's a distinction between Roman Catholic, big C Catholic, and little c Catholic, meaning universal. So the small c Catholic, we are, and so this is actually one of the parties that I was talking about, the sort of reformers versus the small c Catholics. That was a distinction, that the reformers were trying to go their own way, while the small c Catholics wanted to remain within the English church, but kind of maintain that old lineage in a more direct way. So, yeah. Yes. Yes. We are, the apostolic succession, we go all the way back. Yes. Yes, exactly. Yes, yeah. So the Sarum rite is an important part of our legacy as well. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, Tim, you mentioned the Methodist Church and
Yes.
the difference with the Methodist Church, and also there have been efforts to combine Lutheran and Episcopal churches.
I'm glad you brought that up. So yes, so as it stands, we are currently in full communion with the Evangelical Lutheran Church. So the ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, ELCA, we are in full communion with them. So a Lutheran pastor can serve here at Christ Church. I, as an Episcopal priest, can serve in a Lutheran church. We are actually in full communion with 7 or 8 different churches right now. Part of that is that you need to, let's see if I can remember the 4 parts. We say that we believe in the authority of the Bible, the historic creeds, the apostolic succession, and I'm missing one, there's 4. The apostolic succession, which is that bishops have had hands laid on going all the way back to the apostles. That is the sticking point for us and the Methodists. Because at this moment in 1784 that I was talking about, when Seabury goes to England, there's a group of, they're not Methodists yet, they're still part of the Anglican Church, they are followers of Wesley, but they're still part of the Anglican Church. They are not patient. They don't want to wait around for the English Church to say yay or nay about bishops, so they make their own bishops. And so they are no longer part of the apostolic succession, and thus that is one of the sort of sticking points between the, because actually, yes, you might have noted that, I think it was last year, the Methodists, the UMC, voted to, reinstate communion with the Episcopal Church, and the Episcopal Church said, thank you, that's nice, not so fast. And the apostolic succession is one of those big sticking points. However, this is just another aside, so one of the groups that we are in communion with is the Moravian Church, which is originally a German church. They are in communion with the Evangelical Lutherans. So being in full communion means every time there is a bishop consecrated, you have someone representing your church there. So now every single ELCA bishop who is made, there is a Moravian bishop there too. So eventually, the Moravians who are part of the apostolic succession will make enough Lutheran bishops who are part of the apostolic succession that it's a moot point. It's a long way of saying infighting is, we're really good at making complications in all of this. Yes?
During the 500 years since Martin Luther, the Reform movement underwent additional splits. Do you think that this additional reform or innovation helps getting closer to God or creates schism? And what do you foresee to happen in the future based on the past?
So the question of schism versus this is a good thing, I will say both. I think it is schism, but also I think, different strokes for different folks. I think that you kind of need to have a variety of, I think it's important for people to find different ways of worshiping, different ways to know God, and I'm not offended by the idea that, somebody's going to go down the street and they're going to, worship in one way and I'm going to worship in the other way, as long as we're all trying to find God. Longer term, I think actually, as is exemplified by these sharing of communion that I was talking about, I think more and more, particularly the mainline churches, are going to share communion and kind of share resources. So I think longer term, the distinction between a Methodist and a Presbyterian and a Congregationalist and an Episcopalian is going to be a little bit more kind of forgotten. I would imagine within 100 years, yes, each church will still exist in its own way, but there will be a lot more pooling of resources. That was my thought.
We all have to follow the Ten Commandments. God first and love thy neighbor as thyself.
Amen. Yeah. All right. Any more questions? Well, on that note, thank you. Sorry for speaking so fast, but and yes, God bless you. Have a wonderful day.